The scream tore through the quiet suburban street like a knife through silk. It was raw, jagged, and unmistakably humana sound that made your heart lurch before your mind could catch up. By the time Julian Torres and Marcus Reed stepped out onto their porch, the neighborhood had already frozen, eyes darting toward the source, the house next door, where their neighbor, Carl Grayson, stood red-faced, hurling slurs into the dusk. Julian's hand tightened around Marcus's, his pulse racing as Carl's voice grew louder, venomous words spilling over the neatly trimmed hedges that separated their homes. "You don't belong here," Carl shouted, his finger jabbing toward their pastel blue house, its porch adorned with hanging flower baskets. The accusation wasn't new, but tonight, it carried a sharper edge, like a storm that had been brewing too long. Marcus, always the calmer of the two, squeezed Julian's hand back, his dark eyes steady. "Let him yell," he murmured, his voice low, almost a whisper. "He's just noise." But Julian's chest burned. He wanted to shout back, to match Carl's rage with his own, but Marcus's quiet strength anchored him. They'd moved to this small Virginia town seeking peace, a place to build a life together after years of city chaos. Instead, they'd found Carl. The neighborhood of Willow Creek was picture-perfect on the surface, rows of craftsman-style homes, kids on bikes, and community barbecues every summer. Julian, a 32-year-old graphic designer with a quick laugh and a knack for sketching portraits, had fallen in love with the place instantly. Marcus, a 35-year-old high school history teacher with a gentle demeanor and a passion for old jazz records, had been more cautious but hopeful. They'd bought the house on Maple Lane 6 months ago, dreaming of quiet evenings and a garden they'd tend together. But Carl, a widower in his late 50s who lived alone next door, had made it clear from day one that he didn't want their kind in his neighborhood. It started small glares from his porch, muttered comments when they passed by. But lately, Carl's hostility had escalated. He'd bang on their shared fence when they laughed too loudly in their backyard. He'd leave anonymous notes in their mailbox, scrawled with Bible verses about sin. Last week, he'd called the city to complain about their excessive porch decorations, meaning the rainbow flag they'd hung for Pride Month. Each incident chipped away at Julian's patience. But Marcus, ever the diplomat, urged restraint. "We don't fight hate with hate," he'd say, his voice steady as a metronome. "We live. We love. That's enough." Tonight, though, Carl's rage felt different. He stood on his lawn, his gray hair wild, his voice carrying to every corner of the street. "You're ruining this place," he bellowed, as neighbors peeked through curtains. A few kids stopped their bikes, staring. Julian's jaw clenched, his brown eyes flashing with a mix of fear and fury. He was shorter than Marcus, with a wiry build and a habit of wearing colorful scarves even in summer. But his energy was electric, always ready to spark. "He's gone too far," Julian hissed, stepping forward. Marcus pulled him back gently. "Not now, Jules. Not like this." His voice was calm, but his grip was firm, his tall frame a quiet shield. Marcus had grown up in a rougher part of Baltimore, where he'd learned to navigate hostility with a cool head. He'd faced worse than Carl men who'd spit at him for being black, for being gay, for daring to exist. But Julian, who'd grown up in a tight-knit Latino family in Miami, wasn't used to this kind of open hatred. It felt personal, like a violation of the home they'd built together. As Carl's tirade continued, a small crowd gathered, neighbors who'd never said much to Julian and Marcus beyond polite nods. Mrs. Delaney, the elderly woman across the street, clutched her cardigan, her face unreadable. The Patels, who ran the local bakery, stood on their porch, whispering to each other. Julian felt their eyes like a weight, judging, measuring. Were they with Carl? Or just curious? He couldn't tell. Finally, Carl stormed back into his house, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed. The street fell silent, but the tension lingered, thick as fog. Julian turned to Marcus, his voice shaking. "We can't keep ignoring this." "He's not stopping." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We don't ignore it," he said quietly. "But we don't fight his way. We're smarter than that." His eyes held a glint of something Julian hadn't seen before, not anger, but resolve. "Let's go inside." That night, as they sat in their cozy living room, surrounded by Marcus's vinyl collection and Julian's half-finished sketches, they began to plan. Not a confrontation, not a shouting match, but something quieter, something that would hit Carl where it hurt most, his pride, his sense of control. They didn't know it yet, but their plan would ripple through Willow Creek, changing not just Carl, but the entire neighborhood. The next morning, Julian woke early, sketching furiously in his notebook. He drew Carl's house, but not as it was gray, lifeless, with overgrown weeds. He imagined it vibrant, covered in flowers, with a community garden in the front yard. "What if we don't just fight back?" he said to Marcus over coffee. "What if we show him what this neighborhood could be?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You're talking about winning hearts, not arguments." "Exactly," Julian said, his eyes alight. "We don't need to yell. We need to build something better." They started small. That weekend, they invited the Patels over for dinner, sharing homemade empanadas and Marcus's famous peach cobbler. They talked about the neighborhood, about their dreams for a community space where everyone could gather. The Patels, hesitant at first, warmed to the idea. "Our kids need a place to play," Mrs. Patel said, her voice soft but firm. "Somewhere safe." The following week, Julian and Marcus knocked on Mrs. Delaney's door, offering to help with her garden. She was wary, her eyes sharp, but she let them in. As they weeded and planted, she told stories of Willow Creek's past, how it used to be a place where neighbors knew each other's names. "It's not like that anymore," she said, glancing toward Carl's house. By the end of the month, their plan was taking shape. They proposed a community garden project to the neighborhood association, a plot on the empty lot at the end of Maple Lane. They'd fund it themselves at first, with donations from anyone who wanted to join. The Patels signed up. Mrs. Delaney offered seeds from her heirloom roses. Even the Wilsons, a young couple with a newborn, pitched in with a small check. Carl, predictably, was furious. He showed up at the association meeting, his face red, his voice loud. "This is a stunt," he shouted, pointing at Julian and Marcus. "They're trying to take over." But the room didn't rally behind him. The Patels spoke up, then Mrs. Delaney, even Mr. Thompson, a quiet retiree who rarely left his house, said, "Let them try. What's the harm?" The vote passed. The garden would happen. And as Julian and Marcus stood together that night, watching the stars from their porch, Julian felt something shift. They weren't just fighting Carl anymore. They were building something, a legacy, a community, a quiet revolution. But Carl wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The first shovel broke ground on the community garden under a crisp autumn sky, the kind that painted Willow Creek in shades of amber and crimson. Julian and Marcus stood side by side, their hands calloused from weeks of planning, their faces lit with determination. Around them, a small group of neighbors, Mrs. Delaney, the Patels, and a few others cheered as the lot, once an eyesore of weeds and broken bottles, began its transformation. But Carl Grayson was watching. From his porch, his arms crossed, his scowl deepened with every laugh that echoed from the garden site. Julian caught his eye and felt a chill, not from the cool September air, but from the raw hatred in Carl's gaze. "He's not going to let this go," Julian muttered to Marcus, wiping dirt from his hands. He doesn't have to, Marcus replied, his voice steady as he handed Julian a seedling. We're not doing this for him. We're doing it for us. For them. He nodded toward the Patel's kids, who were gleefully digging holes, their faces smeared with dirt and joy. The garden project wasn't just about plants. It was a statement of refusal to let Carl's bigotry define their place in Willow Creek. Julian and Marcus had spent weeks rallying support, knocking on doors, and sharing their vision. They'd created flyers with Julian's vibrant sketches, promising a space for everyone, a vegetable patch for families, a flower bed for Mrs. Delaney's roses, even a small stage for open mic nights. The response had been slow but steady, with more neighbors joining each day. Carl, however, saw it as a personal attack. The morning after the groundbreaking, Julian found their mailbox stuffed with another note. This one more vicious than the last. You're not fooling anyone. It read in Carl's jagged scrawl. This is a sin, and you'll pay. Julian's hands shook as he showed it to Marcus, who read it silently, his jaw tight. We need to report this, Julian said, his voice sharp. He's threatening us now. Marcus nodded, but his eyes were distant, calculating. We will, but not yet. If we go to the police now, he'll spin it, see we're overreacting. We need to be strategic. Julian hated the waiting, the restraint, but he trusted Marcus's instincts. Instead, they poured their energy into the garden. They worked late into the evenings, planting rows of tomatoes, zucchini, and sunflowers. Mrs. Delaney taught Julian how to prune roses, her hands steady despite her age. The Patels brought homemade samosas to share, and even Mr. Thompson showed up one day with a battered toolbox, offering to build raised garden beds. The garden became a hub, a place where Willow Creek's fragmented community began to reconnect. Kids played while parents chatted, swapping stories and recipes. Julian and Marcus were at the heart of it, their laughter and easy affection drawing people in. But not everyone was won over. Some neighbors stayed away, their silence louder than Carl's shouts. Julian felt their absence like a bruise, a reminder that acceptance was a battle not yet won. Carl's harassment didn't stop. He'd blast his radio when they worked in the garden, drowning out their conversations with static-heavy talk shows. He'd park his truck across their driveway, forcing them to squeeze past. Once, Julian caught him spraying weed killer near their shared fence, dangerously close to their own flower beds. He's trying to provoke us, Julian said, his voice low as they stood in their kitchen, the scent of Marcus's cooking filling the air. Then we don't give him the satisfaction, Marcus replied, stirring a pot of gumbo. He wants a fight. We give him kindness instead. Julian raised an eyebrow. Kindness. To him. Marcus smiled, a slow, thoughtful curve of his lips. Not directly. But every time we make this neighborhood better, we take away his power. He thrives on division. We're building unity. The next day, they invited the entire street to a garden planning meeting at their house. To their surprise, nearly 20 people showed up, crowding their living room with folding chairs and coffee mugs. Julian presented his sketches for the garden's layout, his enthusiasm infectious. Marcus shared their budget, transparent about every penny they'd spent. When Mrs. Patel suggested a weekly farmer's market to sell the garden's produce, the room buzzed with excitement. But Carl crashed the meeting. He stormed in, uninvited, his face flushed. You're turning this place into a circus, he shouted, his voice cutting through the chatter. This is my home, and you're making a mockery of it. The room went silent. Julian's heart pounded, his fists clenching. But Marcus stood, his voice calm but firm. Carl, this garden is for everyone. You're welcome to join us. Plant something. Be part of it. Carl laughed, A harsh, bitter sound. Join you. I'd rather burn it down. He stormed out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the sketches he'd pinned to the wall. What if he does something worse? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What if he hurts someone? Marcus sat beside him, his hand resting on Julian's knee. He's angry because he's losing. People are talking to us now, not him. Keep going, Jules. We're stronger than he is. The next morning, they found their garden plot vandalized, seedlings uprooted, tools scattered. Julian's heart sank, but Marcus's eyes narrowed with determination. He thinks this will stop us, Marcus said, picking up a broken shovel. He's wrong. They rallied the neighbors, and by noon, the garden was restored, stronger than before. Mrs. Delaney brought new seedlings. The Wilsons offered to install a security camera. The Patel's kids painted signs that read, "Willow Creek grows together." Carl's act of destruction had backfired, uniting the neighborhood even more. But Julian knew this was only the beginning. Carl wasn't just a nuisance anymore, was a threat. And they needed a plan, not just to survive him, but to change him. The garden bloomed, defiant and alive, despite Carl's sabotage. By mid-October, rows of green shoots pushed through the soil, and sunflowers stood tall, their golden heads nodding in the breeze. Julian and Marcus worked tirelessly, their hands stained with earth, their hearts buoyed by the neighbors who now greeted them by name. But Carl's shadow loomed larger than ever, his anger simmering like a storm about to break. One evening, as Julian watered the vegetable patch, he noticed a flicker of movement at Carl's window. The curtain twitched, and there he was watching, always watching. Julian's stomach twisted. He's obsessed, he told Marcus later, chopping onions for dinner with more force than necessary. It's not just about the garden. It's us. He hates that we exist. Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. I've been thinking about that, he said. Carl's not just angry. He's lonely. His wife died. What? 5 years ago. No kids. No friends. He's got nothing but his hate to hold on to. Julian paused, knife in hand. You're not seriously feeling sorry for him, are you? Not sorry, Marcus said, choosing his words carefully. But if we understand him, we can outsmart him. He's not going to stop unless something changes, something big. The idea hit Julian like a spark. What if we invite him to the garden's grand opening? He said, his voice tentative but growing bolder. Not just him, everyone. Make it a celebration. Show him he's part of this, whether he likes it or not. Marcus raised an eyebrow, skeptical but intrigued. You think he'd come? No, Julian admitted, a grin spreading across his face. But the invitation will drive him crazy. And if he shows up, we'll be ready. They spent the next week planning the grand opening, set for the Saturday before Thanksgiving. Julian designed invitations, his sketches bursting with color sunflowers, tomatoes, and smiling faces. Marcus organized a potluck, asking every neighbor to bring a dish. The Patels offered to bake desserts. Mrs. Delaney promised her famous cornbread, and even Mr. Thompson volunteered to set up tables. The event was shaping up to be Willow Creek's biggest gathering in years. But Carl's harassment escalated. One morning, Julian found their car tires slashed, the word faggots scratched into the paint. The sight hit him like a punch, his breath catching as he called Marcus outside. This is too far, Julian said, his voice trembling with rage. We need to call the police. Marcus nodded, his face grim. We do. But we keep going. He doesn't get to win. They filed a report, though the off-camera tired man named Jenkins seemed skeptical. Hard to prove it was him without evidence. Jenkins said, scribbling notes. You got cameras. The security camera the Wilsons had installed hadn't caught the act, but it was enough to make Carl nervous. He stopped appearing on his porch for a few days, though Julian could still feel his eyes from behind the curtains. The grand opening arrived under a clear, cold sky. The garden was transformed. String lights hung above the paths. Tables groaned with food, and a small stage held a microphone for open mic performances. Neighbors poured in, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Julian and Marcus stood at the center, welcoming everyone, their hands brushing occasionally as if to remind each other they were in this together. To their shock, Carl showed up. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, his face a mask of disdain. Julian's heart raced, but Marcus squeezed his hand. Let him see this, Marcus whispered. Let him feel what he's missing. The evening was a triumph. Mrs. Patel's daughter read a poem about unity, her voice trembling but clear. Mr. Thompson shared a story about his late wife, who'd loved gardening. Even the Wilsons' baby giggled as Julian made funny faces. The neighborhood was alive, connected, and for the first time, Julian felt like they truly belonged. But Carl's presence was a dark note in the harmony. As the night wound down, he approached the stage, his voice cutting through the chatter. You think this changes anything? He shouted, his words slurring slightly, as if he'd been drinking. You're still not welcome here. The crowd went silent, all eyes on Julian and Marcus. Julian's fists clenched, but Marcus stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying. Carl, this garden is for you, too. You're part of this neighborhood. Join us. The words hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in kindness. Carl's face twisted, caught between rage and something else, something vulnerable. He turned and stormed off, leaving the crowd murmuring. That night, Julian couldn't shake the image of Carl's expression. Did you see his face? He asked Marcus as they cleaned up the garden. It wasn't just anger. It was pain. Marcus nodded, stacking chairs. He's fighting something bigger than us. But we're getting to him. I can feel it. The next day, they found a small, unmarked envelope in their mailbox. Inside was a single sunflower seed. No note. No explanation. Julian stared at it, his heart pounding. Is this from him? Marcus smiled, a quiet, hopeful curve of his lips. Maybe. Or maybe it's just the start of something new. The sunflower seed sat on their kitchen counter, a small, unassuming thing that felt heavier than it should. Julian couldn't stop staring at it, turning it over in his fingers as if it held answers. If this is Carl's idea of an apology, he said, his voice laced with skepticism, it's a pretty weak one. Marcus, flipping through a stack of history essays at the table, glanced up. Maybe it's not an apology. Maybe it's a question. Like he's testing us. Julian frowned, setting the seed down. Testing us. For what? To see if we'll keep being nice while he trashes our lives. Marcus leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. To see if we mean it. All this talk about community, about everyone being welcome. He spent years building walls. Maybe this is him cracking the door open. Just a little. Julian wanted to argue, to say Carl didn't deserve their patience. But he couldn't deny the shift in the neighborhood since the garden's opening. People waved now, stopped to chat. The Patels had invited them to their son's birthday party. Mrs. Delaney had given them a jar of her homemade jam. Even Officer Jenkins, who'd been so dismissive before, had driven by to check on the garden, his tone warmer. Willow Creek was changing, and Carl see'd whether a gesture or a taunt felt like a piece of the puzzle. They decided to plant it. Not in the community garden, but in their own backyard, near the fence that separated their property from Carl's. Julian dug the hole, his hands steady despite the anger still simmering in his chest. Marcus sprinkled water over the soil, his movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. "If he's watching," Marcus said, "let him see we're not afraid." The days that followed were quieter. Carl's truck stayed in his driveway, his radio silent. But Julian couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the prickle at the back of his neck whenever he worked in the yard. He started sketching again, late at night, his pencil capturing the garden, the neighbors, even Carl's house, its windows dark but no longer menacing, as if the seed had softened its edges. The community garden grew busier. The Patel's kids organized a weekly story time under the sunflowers, drawing a small crowd of children and parents. Mrs. Delaney started a gardening club, teaching anyone who'd listen how to propagate cuttings. Julian and Marcus hosted an open mic night, where Marcus surprised everyone by singing an old Billie Holiday song, his voice rich and soulful. Julian watched him, his heart swelling, and thought, "This is why we stay. This is why we fight." But Carl wasn't done. One chilly November morning, Julian found their backyard fence spray painted with a single word, "Leave." The paint was still wet, the letters jagged and uneven. Julian's hands shook as he called Marcus outside, his voice breaking. "This is it, Marcus. We can't keep pretending he's going to change." Marcus stared at the graffiti, his face unreadable. "We go to the police again," he said finally. "But we don't let this stop us." The garden, the neighborhood, it's bigger than him now. They reported the vandalism, and this time, Officer Jenkins took it seriously. The security camera had caught a shadowy figure near the fence, too blurry to identify, but enough to warrant a visit to Carl's house. Jenkins returned with little to report. Carl had denied everything, claiming he'd been asleep, but the officer's tone was firm. "I'll be keeping an eye on him," he said. "You boys keep doing what you're doing. The garden's good for this town." The incident lit a fire under Julian. He threw himself into the garden, organizing a winter planting workshop to keep the momentum going. He designed new flyers, bolder and brighter, and Marcus helped distribute them, their footsteps crunching through fallen leaves. The neighborhood responded: more volunteers, more donations, more faces at every event. But Julian couldn't shake the fear that Carl was planning something worse. Then, one evening, Mrs. Delaney knocked on their door, her face pale. "I saw Carl in his backyard," she said, her voice trembling. "He was digging. Not gardening digging. Like he was hiding something." Julian's stomach dropped. "Hiding what?" "I don't know," she said, clutching her shawl. "But it didn't look right. Be careful, boys." That night, Marcus sat Julian down, his hands steady on Julian's shoulders. "We need a new plan," he said. "Something that forces Carl to confront himself. Not us. He's not just angry at us, he's angry at the world. We need to show him what he's missing." Julian nodded, his mind racing. "What if we make the garden impossible to ignore? A big event, bigger than the opening. Something that pulls the whole town in." Marcus grinned, catching his enthusiasm. "A winter festival. Lights, music, food. We make it so big, so beautiful. He can't look away." They spent the next week planning, their living room a chaos of sketches, budgets, and lists. The festival would be held in the garden, with a bonfire, live music, and a holiday market. They'd invite every neighbor, every business, even the local high school's choir. And they'd invite Carl, not with a flyer, but with a handwritten note, slipped into his mailbox under the cover of night. The note was simple. In Marcus's neat handwriting: "Carl, the garden is yours, too. Come see what we've built." Julian and Marcus. They didn't expect a response. But as they prepared for the festival, Julian noticed something strange. The sunflower seed they'd planted was sprouting. Impossibly. In the cold November soil. It was small. Fragile. But there a tiny green shoot reaching for the sky. The winter festival took shape like a dream woven from light and sound. The community garden glowed with thousands of fairy lights strung across the paths, their soft golden shimmer reflecting off the frost-kissed ground. Tables lined the lot, laden with hot cider, homemade pies, and crafts from local artisans. The high school choir practiced carols, their voices mingling with the crackle of a bonfire at the garden's center. Julian and Marcus moved through the chaos, directing volunteers, their faces flushed with excitement and exhaustion. "This is it," Julian said, adjusting a string of lights. "This is what we've been working for." Marcus nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It's more than us now. Look at them." He gestured to the neighbors, dozens of them, laughing, eating, sharing stories. The Patel's kids ran through the garden, chasing each other with sparklers. Mrs. Delaney sat by the bonfire, her face soft as she chatted with Mr. Thompson. Even Officer Jenkins was there, off duty, sipping cider with his wife. But Julian's eyes kept drifting to Carl's house, its windows dark, its silence ominous. "Do you think he'll come?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Doesn't matter. We've already won." The festival began as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violet and gold. The choir's voices rose, clear and haunting, singing Silent Night as neighbors gathered around the bonfire. Julian took the stage, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "This garden isn't just about plants," he said, his words carrying over the crowd. "It's about yous, about building something together, no matter who we are or where we come from. Thank you for being part of it." The applause was warm, heartfelt, and for a moment, Julian felt invincible. Marcus joined him on stage, his arms slipping around Julian's waist, and the crowd cheered louder. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a declaration, a refusal to hide, to shrink, to let Carl's hate define them. Then, halfway through the night, Carl appeared. He stood at the edge of the garden, his coat pulled tight, his face half hidden in the shadows. Julian's heart skipped, but Marcus squeezed his hand. "Stay calm," he whispered. "Let him see." Carl didn't approach, didn't speak. He just watched, his eyes moving from the bonfire to the tables, from the choir to the kids playing tag. Julian couldn't read his expression, anger, confusion, or something softer. He couldn't tell. But Carl stayed, longer than Julian expected, before turning and disappearing into the night. The festival was a triumph, the kind of night that felt like a memory even as it happened. Neighbors lingered late, swapping stories, making plans for the garden's future. The Patels proposed a spring planting festival. Mrs. Delaney suggested a book club. Even Jenkins offered to help with security, his tone gruff but kind. But the next morning, Julian and Marcus woke to a new act of vandalism. The garden's welcome signa, hand-painted board reading "Willow Creek Grows Together," was smashed, its pieces scattered across the lot. Julian's heart sank, his hands shaking as he picked up the fragments. "He's never going to stop," he said, his voice breaking. Marcus knelt beside him, his hands steady as he gathered the pieces. "He's scared," he said quietly. "This is him lashing out because he knows he's losing." "Losing?" Julian snapped, his eyes flashing. "He's destroying everything we've built." "No," Marcus said, his voice firm. "He's destroying wood and paint. What we've built, the people, the connections, that's untouchable." They repaired the sign, stronger this time, with help from the neighbors. The Patel's kids painted new designs, brighter and bolder. Mrs. Delaney brought a new board, sturdier than the last. The Wilsons offered to install a second camera, aimed directly at the garden's entrance. The community rallied, their support a quiet roar against Carl's hatred. But Julian couldn't shake the fear. What's next? He asked Marcus that night, his voice raw. What if he escalates? What if he hurts someone? Marcus pulled him close, his arms a steady anchor. Then we face it together. But I think he's running out of moves. That seed. The way he watched at the festival's not as sure of himself as he wants us to think. The next day, they found another envelope in their mailbox. This one held a folded piece of paper. No words, just a rough sketch of a sunflower. It was clumsy, almost childlike, but unmistakable. Julian stared at it, his heart pounding. This is him, isn't it? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with something like hope. He's trying to say something. We just need to keep listening. They decided to double down. The garden would host a New Year's Eve event, smaller but just as warm, with lanterns and hot chocolate. They'd invite Carl again, not with a note, but in person. It was a risk, a leap, but Julian felt it in his bones. This was the moment to push, to see if Carl could change. The decision to confront Carl face to face felt like stepping onto a tightrope. Julian's hands shook as he and Marcus walked across the frost-crisp grass to Carl's house, the late December air biting at their faces. The sunflower sketch was tucked in Julian's pocket, a fragile talisman of hope or a taunt, depending on how this went. Marcus knocked, his knuckles steady against the faded red door. Silence stretched, heavy and tense, until the door creaked open. Carl stood there, his gray hair disheveled, his eyes wary. What do you want? He growled, his voice rough but lacking its usual venom. We're inviting you to the New Year's Eve event, Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. It's at the garden. Hot chocolate, lanterns, music. Everyone's coming. Carl's eyes narrowed, his hands gripping the doorframe. Why would I want anything to do with you? Julian stepped forward, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. Because this is your neighborhood, too. We're not going anywhere, Carl. Neither are you. So let's figure out how to live together. Carl's face twisted, a mix of anger and something softer, something raw. He didn't answer, just slammed the door. Julian's shoulders slumped, but Marcus squeezed his hand. We planted a seed, Marcus said quietly. Now we wait. The New Year's Eve event was smaller than the winter festival, but no less warm. Lanterns glowed along the garden paths, casting soft light on the faces of neighbors bundled in coats and scarves. The Patels brought chai, spiced and steaming. Mrs. Delaney shared stories of New Year's Eves from decades past. Julian and Marcus moved through the crowd, their hands brushing, their smiles a quiet defiance. Carl didn't show. Julian kept glancing at his house, its windows dark, its silence louder than ever. But as midnight approached, the neighborhood gathered in a circle, each person lighting a lantern to release into the sky. Julian's lantern carried a wish for peace, Marcus's for strength. As the lanterns floated upward, their glow mingling with the stars, Julian felt a weight lift, if only for a moment. The next morning, they found the garden untouched, the sign intact. But in their backyard, near the fence, the sunflower sprout was gone uprooted, its roots dangling in the dirt. Julian's heart sank, but Marcus's eyes narrowed. This isn't over, he said, his voice steady. He's still fighting himself. They reported the vandalism to Jenkins, who promised to increase patrols. But Julian couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Carl's actions were erratic, unpredictable, like a man teetering on the edge of something he didn't understand. Then, 2 days later, Mrs. Delaney called, her voice urgent. He's at the garden, she said. Carl. He's just standing there. You need to come. Julian and Marcus rushed over, their breath visible in the cold morning air. Carl was there, in the middle of the garden, staring at the sunflower patch. He held a small trowel, his hands dirty, his face unreadable. Julian's heart pounded, but Marcus stepped forward, his voice gentle. Carl, what are you doing? Carl didn't look up. I planted it, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. The seed. I took it back because, I don't know. I didn't want you to have it. Julian's fists clenched, but Marcus held up a hand, signaling patience. Why not? Marcus asked, his tone even. Carl's shoulders sagged, his eyes fixed on the dirt. Because you're everything I'm not. Happy. Together. People listen to you. I've got nothing. The words hung in the air, raw and jagged. Julian's anger softened, replaced by something heavier: pity. Maybe. Or understanding. You could have this, too, he said, his voice softer than he expected. The garden. The neighbor sits for everyone. Carl shook his head, his voice barely audible. I don't know how. Marcus knelt beside him, his hands resting on his knees. Start small. Plant something. Talk to someone. You don't have to be alone. Carl didn't answer, but he didn't leave, either. He stayed, his trowel idle in his hand, as the sun rose over Willow Creek. Julian and Marcus exchanged a glance. A silent agreement. This was progress. Fragile but real. They left him there, giving him space. The rest of the day, they worked in the garden, joined by neighbors who'd heard about Carl's visit. The Patels brought lunch. Mrs. Delaney offered advice on winter crops. And even Jenkins stopped by, his presence a quiet reassurance. That night, Julian sketched Carl as he'd seen him in the garden, not angry, not hateful, but lost, searching for something he couldn't name. Do you think he'll change? Julian asked, his pencil pausing. Marcus leaned over, kissing his forehead. I think he's already changing. He just doesn't know it yet. Winter settled over Willow Creek, blanketing the garden in frost. But the community's warmth kept it alive. Julian and Marcus spent their days planning spring, their evenings curled up with coffee and dreams. Carl's presence in the garden that morning lingered like a question mark, unanswered but heavy with possibility. Then, one January morning, they found a small clay pot on their porch. Inside was a sunflower seedling, its leaves fragile but green, its roots packed carefully in soil. There was no note, no signature, but Julian knew. It's him, he said, his voice catching. Carl. Marcus smiled, his eyes bright. He's trying. They planted the seedling in the community garden, near the spot where Carl had stood. Word spread, and neighbors stopped by to see it, their whispers filled with curiosity and hope. Mrs. Delaney called it Carl's sunflower, and the name stuck. The Patel's kids drew pictures of it, taping them to the garden's sign. Even Jenkins nodded approvingly when he saw it, his gruff voice softening. Maybe he's coming around. Carl didn't appear in the garden again, but his house was less silent. His radio played softer music, old country tunes instead of angry talk shows. His truck stayed in the driveway, no longer blocking theirs. Once, Julian caught him watering his own lawn, his eyes flicking toward the garden, lingering on the sunflower. The neighborhood continued to change. The garden became a hub, not just for planting, but for connection. The Patels started a weekly cooking class, teaching kids how to make samosas. Mrs. Delaney's gardening club grew, drawing retirees and young families alike. Julian and Marcus hosted a monthly art night, where neighbors painted, sketched, and shared stories. Each event chipped away at the walls that had once divided Willow Creek, replacing them with bridges. But Julian still carried a knot of caution. What if he goes back to his old ways? He asked Marcus one night, his sketchbook open to a drawing of the garden, Carl's sunflower at its center. Then we keep going, Marcus said, his hand resting on Julian's. We've already changed the story. He's not the villain anymore, he's just a man, trying to find his place. In February, Carl surprised them. He showed up at the garden's first spring planting meeting, held in the community center to escape the cold. He sat in the back, his arms crossed, his face guarded. Julian's heart raced, but Marcus nodded encouragingly, urging him to keep speaking. Julian presented their plan's new crops: a butterfly garden, a mural for the fence. When he asked for volunteers, Carl's hand went up, hesitant but unmistakable. I can help with the fence, Carl said, his voice gruff. I'm good with wood. The room went quiet, then erupted in murmurs of surprise and approval. Julian swallowed hard, his voice steady. That'd be great, Carl. Thank you. Over the next weeks, Carl worked alongside them, his hands steady as he repaired the fence, his words few but civil. He didn't apologize, didn't talk about the past, but his presence was enough. The neighbors noticed, their warmth extending to him. Slowly, cautiously. Mrs. Delaney shared her cornbread. The Patels invited him to their cooking class. Even the Wilsons' baby giggled when Carl made a clumsy attempt at a smile. By spring, the garden was a riot of color. The sunflower, Carl's sunflower, standing tall among the blooms. At the spring planting festival, Carl stood at the edge of the crowd, not joining in but not turning away either. Julian watched him, his heart full. We did this, he whispered to Marcus, his hand finding his partner's. No, Marcus said, his voice soft but certain. We all did. The festival ended with a lantern release, just like New Year's Eve. As the lights floated skyward, Julian saw Carl slip something into the garden's suggestion box, a folded piece of paper, too quick to read. Later, when they opened it, they found a single sentence in Carl's jagged scrawl: I'm sorry. Julian's eyes stung, and Marcus pulled him close, their hands entwined. They didn't need to say it aloud. This was their victory, not over Carl, but with him. Their quiet revenge hadn't been about destruction, but creation, building a community so strong, so inclusive, that even the hardest hearts could soften. As they stood together, watching the lanterns disappear into the night, Julian knew Willow Creek would never be the same. And neither would they.